People who grew up religious. What took you away from religion? One of my good friends throughout high school was really involved with the Catholic Church. She volunteered. She helped with teen masses. She sung in the choir. Everyone knew her. The first year out of high school, she got pregnant with her son, and everyone in the church, the same people who knew her since she was 12, completely shunned her. She kept her son, didn't consider anything to the contrary, and wanted to raise him in the church, but was completely ignored and tossed aside when she said she wasn't marrying the father. She was heartbroken, and her whole world was rocked because so much of her life was devoted to the church. They couldn't see past her out-of-wedlock mistake. That's when I realized the people who were supposed to be this spiritual family were horrible people. So much judgment and condemnation. They spoke horribly about her even after she stopped going. At that point, more than a few of us left the church around the same age who knew her, and other than the occasional wedding and funeral, I haven't been back.
That's a tough situation. It's strange how people can be so quick to judge, especially in a community that's supposed to be supportive. Your friend actually showed a lot of strength by keeping her son and wanting to raise him in that environment. It's disappointing when places meant to foster love end up being so negative. It makes sense that you and others left the church after seeing that treatment.
It's funny, I've lived mostly in religious conservative states, raised Christian by my parents, kindly Christians, but I've landed as agnostic myself these days. I think I always would have struggled to believe in a God for sure, but the deal breaker has been watching almost every single religious person in my life actively disobey the commands of Jesus day to day. The man preached, for the most part, radical kindness and love. And aside from my parents, every person who ever taught me about that love ultimately proved they never understood it at all. I'm not a perfect guy, and I wouldn't call myself a Christian, but I'd shake Jesus' hand well before most of his followers.
It's interesting how personal experiences shape beliefs. Growing up around strong religious values can create a disconnect when you see people not living by those teachings. The gap between the ideal and reality can be pretty disheartening. It's easy to see why someone would question faith when the actions of others don't align with the core message. Finding your own path and understanding is important, no matter the background.
I grew up Mormon, and two things ultimately drove me away. One, my own readings of the scriptures. None of it made any sense after a while, and it just seemed more and more fantasy-like. Two, I hated the way the church treated my mother. She was never a full member of the church, and they always treated her as a second-class citizen because of it.
That's an interesting perspective. It's tough when your upbringing conflicts with your beliefs. Realizing things don't add up can be unsettling. And seeing a parent mistreated is a solid reason to step back. It's understandable to seek out a place that values everyone equally. Everyone deserves respect, no matter their background.
I've said this before in another similar thread, but in essence, I stopped feeling spiritual if I ever actually did. Almost everyone around me growing up was religious and seemed to get some kind of fulfillment from their worship. Around my mid-teens, I grew very disillusioned by it all because I just didn't feel anything during religious activities anymore like I thought everyone else did. As the Fray once put it, all my days spent by a telephone that never rang. To this day, I still feel the same and still wonder if everyone is just faking religious fulfillment, but are all too afraid to look too deep into it. Not that I judge, but that's just kind of how I feel.
It's interesting how people can have such different experiences with spirituality. I had a friend who grew up in a religious family, but by high school, he felt the same disillusionment. He often questioned if it was all genuine or just something others clung to for comfort. It made for some deep conversations as we tried to figure out what it all meant, but in the end, I guess it's a personal journey for everyone.
I grew up in a Roman Catholic family and the sort of big community churches that surrounded it. I still believe the entire community around this religion, in the way I experienced it, is a net positive thing. But the priest would talk during service about God speaking to him. which I thought was pretty dope. After Mass one day, as a 12-year-old, or something, I asked him what God's voice sounded like. That was the day I realized what was going on.
It's interesting how our experiences shape beliefs. Growing up in a tight-knit community can have a big impact. That moment with the priest sounds pivotal. Sometimes, questioning things leads to personal insights. Realizing that what we think is one thing could be something else entirely can be a sort of awakening. It's all part of finding your own path, I guess.
Had doubts for years that left me guilt-ridden. Woke up one day and kind of just realized I didn't believe anymore, and why should I feel guilty? If I don't believe in hell or eternal punishment, what was there to be afraid of? The day it clicked, it was like a huge weight had been lifted. I slept like a baby that night.
I can relate to that moment. Sometimes you carry those doubts for a long time, feeling weighed down. When you finally let go of what doesn't make sense to you, it's freeing. It's like everything shifts, and that clarity makes such a difference. I've had my own experiences where I realized holding on to certain beliefs only caused unnecessary stress. It's nice to feel lighter and more at peace.
They continuously preach that they love one another and God loves everyone. But when people go through a hard time, they're nowhere to be found. My own family cut me off, no contact. All because some man misinterpreted some Bible scriptures and told them I was a bad person. I was 19, typical teenager still working myself out.
It's tough when people preach love but can't show it in tough times. It sounds like you were just figuring things out like any teen. Having family cut you off based on someone else's words is rough. It's hard to see that kind of judgment when you expect support. Everyone makes mistakes while growing up. It's part of the process. It's definitely a lot to handle at that age.
Went to church every Sunday and Wednesday as a kid. Once I started treating church as an academic study, it didn't hold up with what I knew about liberty, where everyone has the choice to choose what they want to do. I do understand why the church is used for community, though, because I met some very good friends through the church.
It's interesting how our perspectives change over time. Attending church regularly gave me a chance to connect with people. But as I learned more about different beliefs, I realized that the structure didn't align with my views on personal freedom. Still, those friendships formed during that time have stuck with me. They remind me that community can exist in many forms, even if the setting changes.
In the church I grew up in, 13 was considered the age of reason. When I was 13, I got to choose, go to church or stay home with Grandpa, who may have been atheist, while the rest of the family went to church, including Grandma. So I just hung out with Grandpa. Good times too, because we'd watch old westerns. At age 15, I started to go back to church because there were girls there. At age 18, I moved out and just never really made church a habit.
That sounds pretty relatable. Choosing to hang out with Grandpa instead of going to church probably made for some good memories. Watching old westerns gives a nice vibe. It's funny how hormones can influence decisions, like going back to church for the girls. Then moving out and drifting away from that routine seems common. Life takes you in different directions as you grow up.
Hearing about someone in a different religion having a conversion experience, I had to ask myself if our experiences were more similar than different, and then choosing to accept someone else's experience as being equally valid to my own. Then, if the two experiences were equally true, at least in the beliefs of the ones who experienced them, that means that the religions were equally valid, and then basically all religions could be equally valid, or equally worthless, take your pick.
It's interesting to think about how different beliefs can shape experiences. I remember talking with a friend who had a strong conversion moment. It made me reflect on my own journey and how personal faith can feel. Ultimately, it's about respecting others' views while figuring out what resonates with us. It opens up a lot of questions about the nature of belief and understanding in the world.
Several instances made me at least question religion. During youth group in the Catholic Church, they showed sketches of full-term babies being ripped out with forceps and said that all abortions are performed that way. Church members were handing out anti-gay marriage brochures after Mass one day, early 2000s, and I realized that my beliefs didn't align with the church's. When Notre Dame, my favorite team, lost a football game, and I was told that they would have won had I gone to church that week.
It's interesting how experiences can shape beliefs. I can relate to feeling disconnected from things that used to matter. I remember being part of a group where the vibe just didn't match how I felt inside. Moments like that can really make you reconsider what you thought you believed. Sometimes, it takes a few events to see things in a different light. It's a process for sure.
Well, during my catechism class, I asked a lot of questions I got no answers to. Asked my folks nothing. It just never added up to me on a personal level, you know. If you needed to provide you with life structure, by all means do you, but it just doesn't do it for me. Didn't at 10, and certainly not at 55.
I get that. Sometimes, you just don't connect with certain beliefs or teachings. It can be frustrating when you're looking for answers and come up empty. It's cool if it works for others, but everyone's journey is different. Finding what resonates with you is what's important, no matter your age.
For me, it was starting to question things that didn't make sense and not getting answers that felt satisfying. The more I learned about the world and different perspectives, the harder it was to blindly accept what I'd been taught. It wasn't an overnight thing, but more like a slow realization over time.
I get that. It's like peeling back layers you didn't know existed. You start looking at stuff differently, and it just doesn't sit right anymore. It reminds me of a time my friend began to ask about his upbringing and challenge the norms. It was a gradual process for him too, just realizing that understanding the world takes time and curiosity.
For me, it was getting introduced to science and alternate explanations. I came to the question of how we could rely on the Bible if it was written and controlled by men. So it took me away. Since then, though, I've seen the manifestation of evil in the world, and it has brought me back. There are other personal moments that never let me let go as well.
It's interesting how experiences can shift your perspective. For a friend of mine, questioning beliefs led to a deeper exploration of spirituality. They found strength in reconciling science with personal beliefs. It's a mix of doubt and clarity that shapes their views now. They often talk about moments that challenge them, reminding me how complex faith can be when faced with real-world experiences.
Mom took me to church, Catholic, every Sunday until I was 15 when I started asking not to go. I was always a math and science kid. As I got older, religion just stopped making sense. From the miracles that made no scientific sense to the conflicting stories / lessons / passages. It just didn't work. Been atheist since shortly after that.
I can relate to that feeling. Growing up, I also had a lot of questions about the things we were taught. As I got older, I realized that some beliefs didn't really click with what I was learning in school. It was a gradual shift for me too, moving away from those traditions. Sometimes it just feels like there are more logical explanations out there. It's a personal journey for sure.
Went to a Catholic school, and in mid-high school during our Bible study, I remember thinking that all the stories sounded like one of my fiction books, so outlandish and clearly false. Also, that every path of wrongdoing led to hell seemed quite harsh. Like you're telling me if I steal my friend's muesli bar at lunch, I'm gonna be damned for eternity? MMK.
I get that. It's kind of wild how strict some teachings can be. I remember in school thinking a lot of the rules felt extreme for small mistakes. Like, we all mess up sometimes. Makes you question the stories too, whether they really fit into our everyday lives. Just a lot of pressure for little things, you know?
I went to Catholic school through 8th grade. Seeing teachers and administrators defend the actions of bullies and basically act unchristian is what did it for me. One of them called my mom and told them I shouldn't be hanging out with my best friend because he was a bad influence. He was a good kid with a hard life, lost his mom, and his dad was a Vietnam vet with PTSD. But the teachers didn't like him because he cursed sometimes and had an attitude. He asked too many questions in religious class trying to basically call out bullshit and didn't get great grades. But he stood up for bullied kids and was hilarious and kind.
That sounds tough. It's disappointing when the people meant to guide us act in ways that contradict their values. Your friend sounds like a genuine person, standing up for others when it mattered most. It's interesting how sometimes the ones labeled as bad are actually the good ones. It must have been hard to navigate that environment, especially when the adults weren't setting a good example. It really puts things in perspective.
The hypocrisy and ignorance of it all drove me away. By my late teens and early 20s, it was becoming clear to me that arrogant, condescending, judgmental people were the ones that dress up and go to church. And people with tattoos that drink beer, smoke, and ride motorcycles are far more likely to help a stranger and understand what brotherhood means.
It's interesting how our perspectives can shift as we grow up. I remember feeling the same way about certain groups of people. Some would judge others based on appearances, while those often seen as outsiders showed more kindness. It makes you rethink who really embodies that sense of community and support. People can surprise you when you look beyond the surface.
People would say weird things that didn't make sense or add up, and I never understood some of the more hateful things people would say, but then I got older and reread the texts. I realized belief was inside of me, and that following people wasn't always the way. When I did my own exploration and reading things made more sense, I realized interpretation and understanding can have big effects on how you view religion. I actually became more religious, but in a way that's a bit different to things I was told growing up. I rejected a lot from when I was younger at first, but slowly lessons in life guided me towards the right thinking. But of course I'm still on that journey and still learning every day, and I'm sure I still have a lot to learn.
It's interesting how our perspectives change as we grow. I remember looking at things in a certain way when I was younger, but with time, I started to question those beliefs. Exploring ideas on my own really opened my eyes. I've found that faith can be personal and that it's okay to reshape what you believe. It feels like a constant journey, and I'm always learning and adapting along the way.
I've had this conversation so many times. I was indoctrinated into the church before I could talk. Around 5 or 6, I remember begging God to respond to me. Nothing. Zero. Zilch. As I grew older, I just couldn't reconcile believing in an invisible, non-communicative being. Being that I was a good Catholic boy, I did everything my parents expected until I left home. At that point, I was able to be my non-believing self. You can never leave something you never belonged to.
It sounds like a tough journey. Growing up in a belief system can shape you in ways you don't fully realize until you're out on your own. It's interesting how life experiences shift your perspective. You feel free to explore who you really are, which can be both liberating and confusing. Finding your own path after that kind of upbringing isn't easy, but it seems like you're figuring it out.
I grew up going to many different churches. My mom was a church hopper. We only lasted at most places 2 to 3 years. I learned after a while that it's not about religion. It's about a relationship. Jesus didn't die on the cross to give us religion. He died to show us his love. That's what we are supposed to be doing. Showing his love. 2 hearts.
It's interesting how experiences shape our beliefs. I had a friend who went through similar ups and downs with churches. He eventually realized it was more about the connections we build rather than just following rules. It's about showing kindness and understanding, just like he learned. This shift changed his perspective on faith and community, making it more personal and less about tradition.
I grew up Southern Baptist and in the same church my entire life. In high school, I started questioning things and stopped going by the time I graduated. My mom continued to stay active in the church. When I was 21, my mom took her own life, and he had her funeral at that same church. At the end of the service during the receiving line, a member of the church, one who we had known for years and was a friend of my mom's, shook my hand and said, "I'm sorry that your mom is in hell or killing herself." And I was done after that.
That's a tough story. Growing up with strong beliefs can make it hard when life throws you curveballs. Losing a parent is already hard enough, but then to hear something like that just seems cruel. It's understandable why you'd walk away after such a comment. It seems like a turning point that made you rethink everything you grew up with. Sometimes, people just don't know how to handle grief.
1. The many contradictions in religious texts too. The things God does in the Bible that are supposed to be considered righteous, but in any other context would be horrible. Destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah 3. The history of how the Bible was written. It was translated and rewritten so many times by so many people for so many reasons. Hard to trust that the current iteration is authentic. Despite these reservations, I still consider myself a Christian, but these are the biggest issues for me.
It's interesting, right? Many people grapple with the contradictions in religious texts. Like how certain actions that seem harsh, like the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, are framed as righteous. Then there's the whole writing process of the Bible. Those many translations and edits make you wonder about its authenticity. I get where you're coming from. It's tough navigating faith while questioning those core issues.
My family is very religious, and since I was real young, I had questions I didn't understand, like why is there so much evil in the world? If God knows everything, why does he make people that will be sent to hell? Free will makes no sense if God designed everything. Why would God send people he loves to suffer for all eternity, etc.? TBH, I'm not an atheist. I definitely think something bigger than us is out there. The fact that life even exists is crazy enough for me to think, why couldn't something bigger be out there?
I get where you're coming from. Growing up in a religious family can lead to a lot of questions that don't have easy answers. It's kind of normal to wonder about the nature of evil and free will. I think a lot of people have those thoughts at some point. Just trying to make sense of everything is part of being human, and it sounds like you're on that journey too.
I grew up in a Baptist church. I'm also a medium. So the first takeaway was don't tell the church people what's happening. I was 10 when I had my first encounter with Spirit, or they'll pray for you, and not in a good way. Second was the Bible is actually great for metaphors. The stories in them have good lessons, but in no way should it be taken as a literal guide. For reference maybe, but not to live by word for word.
It's interesting how your upbringing shaped your perspective. Growing up in a strict environment can lead to interesting realizations about faith and spirituality. It's like learning to navigate both worlds, understanding the lessons but also recognizing when things aren't as black and white. Makes you think about how personal beliefs can vary so much, even within the same community. Your experiences must have given you a unique view on religion and mediumship.
This is kind of silly, but I was just a kid and was yelled at for asking about dinosaurs and why they didn't show up in the Bible. The Sunday school teacher treated me like I had asked why we don't get to summon the devil. He made the older kids coach me through classes to make sure I didn't have any other crazy ideas. Basically, 2 of the older kids sat on either side of me during class and told me what to think and shut down any questions I started to have. Even though I was young, I didn't like how this made me feel, and I recognized not being able to question what I was told was concerning. This type of behavior carried on in the church we went to for the few years we went. My mom ended up not liking it either, so we stopped going. She was still very religious for a long time after, but I just couldn't buy into it.
It's interesting how experiences in childhood shape our perspectives. Being shut down for curiosity can leave a mark. I had a similar time in school where questions were not welcomed. It's odd how adults can react when faced with things they can't explain themselves. In the end, a lot of us just seek understanding, but some places don't allow that. It's good your mom recognized it too and made a change.
Funnily enough, Jesus' message. I was raised to love my neighbor as myself, and to spread kindness to everyone despite their deeds. To treat the less fortunate with love. Then I saw what the more religious people around me thought about the homeless, immigrants, people of other races, genders, sexuality, etc., and it just clicked that they did not practice what they claimed to believe. I couldn't in my mind understand why they would preach love and then spew hate. The archdiocese in my area fired one of my high school teachers, Catholic school, for being gay. It bothered me too much. Edit to add, unlike a lot of the other people here, my parents actively encouraged me to question God. They said it was a very important part of the faith journey to question God. When I decided to leave the church, they were crestfallen, but they didn't pressure me. My family aren't the people who I talked about in the first half, and are very loving and caring for everyone they come across, so yay them.
It's interesting how upbringing shapes your views. I can relate to questioning beliefs, especially when you see hypocrisy. It's hard to reconcile teachings of love with actions that spread hate. My friend's experience was similar. They had supportive parents who encouraged critical thinking, which helped them navigate faith. It's a shame when institutions fail to reflect the values they preach. My friend's family was a solid support during their journey.
My Sunday school teacher, and also puberty. He was talking about how you could prove God due to cause and effect, and insisted that there had to be a first cause that got everything rolling. I asked him why that first cause couldn't have just been a random accident or the Big Bang or something, and he didn't have a good answer. Between that and a lack of interest in chastity, it was no contest.
That sounds like a classic moment. It's always interesting when someone is so set in their beliefs, but a good question can really shake things up. It makes you realize how complex these topics can be. I guess figuring things out for ourselves is part of growing up and moving past what we were taught. Pretty relatable experience overall.
80s baby here. We went to the same church every Sunday and here and there throughout the week, almost you might say religiously. Then when I was around 11, we suddenly stopped going to that church, tried a few others a handful of times, and within a few months stopped going to church at all. Was never explained to us kids until a few years ago when my mom finally told me why that happened. Her best friend had an affair with the pastor. In my late teens, I had my own dalliance with religion, joined a youth group at a small church which catered specifically to the punk/emo/metal/hardcore/ska/raver/weirdo/outsider kids, which also hosted local concerts on Friday and Saturday nights. Was a great community that was really crucial for the kids who were part of it. However, as much as I wanted to believe for the sake of being part of it, I eventually felt like it was just kind of far-fetched, outlandish, fairy tale-ish stuff. I stayed friends with a lot of those people, kept going to the shows, but stopped attending the religious part of it. Haven't been religious since.
It's interesting how things change over time. Growing up, church was just part of the routine. Then it got messy with the pastor affair. Later, that punk scene brought a different vibe, a place for misfits to connect. I feel like a lot of us want to belong somewhere, even if the beliefs don't stick. It's all about finding your crew, I guess. Just a phase, or maybe something more.
Please consider subscribing if you enjoyed. Love.